something about the modern comic industry that just drives me nuts is the constant renumbering and rebooting of titles with new number ones. And today I'm going to talk about why companies do this, why it irritates me so much, and I want to hear from you. Does it also annoy you, or am I just an old man telling everyone to get off my lawn? So of course, the number one reason why companies renumber their titles is because they understand it's a way to boost sales. Because collectors love to get their hands on number one issues. And I can relate to that somewhat. I love to collect number ones, but only if the number one matters. In other words, one of my favorite books in my collection is my Wolverine number one. I'm a huge fan of that character, and so to have the first issue of Wolverine is exciting. But this year, we got the 8th volume of Wolverine number one, and who cares? It's not important to me at all to be chasing that. But there is some subset of collectors that it is important to have all the Wolverine number ones. And so Marvel, DC understands that, and so they renumber their titles as a way to make more money. Also, companies can use renumbering as a way to indicate a change in the status quo for a certain character. So for instance, when we went to the Krakoan Age from Jonathan Hickman, every X-Men title started off with a new number one to say, hey, something has changed with the X-Men. And I can at least appreciate that. But I'm going to get to it in a minute. I think there are other ways that you can show that change in the status quo without having to renumber the title. And another reason why companies renumber their titles, and this is the one that I can appreciate the most, is that it provides a good jumping on point for a new reader. So in other words, they realize that little Bobby might be confused jumping into issue 451 of something, might think that this title is inaccessible to him. But all of a sudden, here's a number one of Wolverine, then they can get on board with that. And I appreciate that because, of course, all of us collectors should want new readers to come into the hobby. So I do value how renumbering with new number ones can bring new people into the hobby. But once again, I think there are better ways to do that I'll get to in just a minute. Now, why am I so annoyed by this renumbering? Well, I'm a person who loves to collect runs and is a completionist. And all of this renumbering makes that task so much more complicated and confusing for a collector like me. In other words, if I want to collect the Wolverine run, do I just need volume 1? That's the original. That's the one that is most sacred. Or do I have to collect all 8 volumes? Or if I started reading comics when volume 5 was out, if I collect volume 5 of Wolverine, is that a true run? Or is that just some random books in the middle of Wolverine comics that have come out? What is it that I'm supposed to collect? And it becomes even more confusing with titles like X-Men, where you originally had a title X-Men that eventually became Uncanny X-Men, and then they went back and forth with that titling, and now you have Uncanny X-Men and X-Men both at the same time. Well, what books am I supposed to collect if I want to collect the definitive X-Men run? It's just so confusing. And if I am collecting volume 5 and I realize, hey, all I need is issue number 6, so I run off to my LCS and I start thumbing through the back issue bins and I see an issue 6 and I'm trying to remember, wait, is this the volume 5 one? Or is this volume 4? Or is it volume 6? What issue number 6 is this? And of course I can pull up my smartphone and look through the images, but it just adds such another extra unnecessary layer to completing my runs than just being able to say, oh yeah, I need issue number 273. Is it here? Yes or no? Something else that renumbering does is take away from the grandness of a title and a character. I remember as a kid going into the comic shop and seeing, oh, Amazing Spider-Man is in its 300s. This title and this character is much more important than this Wonder Man and Quasar character who have these issues into the 11s and 12s. There's something mighty about Spider-Man. And that's lost, I think, with all this renumbering. And I think Marvel, DC have recognized that with trying to do like legacy numbering, where it says, okay, this is volume 8 of Wolverine, but it's really number in small print, number 330. And it just isn't the same. When My Amazing Spider-Man says issue 30 on it, that's the big number, and you've got this tiny 910 or whatever it is. It just doesn't have that same sense of gravitas, that same sense of magnificent, as if it simply said Amazing Spider-Man number 910. Now, of course, the companies, when they get close to those big numbers, sometimes they'll go back to the original numbering to get us all to buy issue number 900 before then starting over with a new number 1. Obviously, a lot of this, again, is just about the money. Now, something I mentioned earlier is that even though I don't like it, I can at least see the value in renumbering when you're trying to signal that there's a real change in the status quo of a character or team, or you're trying to bring in new readers. But what really frustrates me is when there's a renumbering for no reason. And usually the companies will try to make some excuse like, oh, we've got a new creative team. Well, who cares? There have been new creative teams forever. And for decades, you never renumbered. And it wasn't an issue at all. But you're just trying to drive up sales. And again, it reduces the magnificence of the title in a way to make an extra buck. And I think hurts the title in the long run. Because again, it just diminishes it in collectors' minds. At least it does for me. I'm curious, does it do it for you? Am I just some kind of crazy man? Or is this frustrating to anyone else? Plus, I think there are other ways to accomplish those goals without going through renumbering. Obviously, comic companies did that for decades without renumbering. For instance, one thing you can do is to make a real celebration or a change in the status quo at some round number. And people like numbers. Again, that's why number 1. So when we get to like an issue 100 or 150, as a kid, I remember, those were always like double-sized issues. Or eventually in the early 90s, they were all like gimmick covers. And as much as gimmick covers could sometimes be annoying, and as much as the market certainly got flooded with gimmick covers for no reason at certain points, I still prefer that to just renumbering a title. So you can do those types of things through cover art. You can show, when people saw Amazing Spider-Man number 252, the black suit of Spider-Man, they realized from that art, hey, there is a change in the status quo. They didn't need Amazing Spider-Man to go from 251 to number 1 to say, oh, hey, this is the black suit Spider-Man. No, the collector really understood it, and so he bought it. And I'm sure that issue sold very well just from the cover art. It didn't need a number 1. Now, something else companies used to do to bring in new readers was, rather than renumbering the whole title, to instead advertise a certain new storyline and then number that storyline. So I remember as a kid reading the Return of the Sinister Six storyline in Amazing Spider-Man, beginning with issue number 334. And so that issue said part 1 of this storyline. The next issue said part 2. And so it still had this sense of renumbering, giving you a new number 1 so that a new reader could know, hey, this is a great jumping on point, without renumbering the whole title and diminishing the significance of that title. And I wish companies would just go back to that model and do that and that alone. But once again, am I just a grumpy old man? What do you think? Like, comment, subscribe.